Welcome back. Last time we laid the rather bleak groundwork for why mass demonstrations, despite their visibility, often hit a brick wall when trying to topple modern regimes. We defined our terms, met our theoretical guides, and acknowledged that the heady days of 1989 seem rather distant now. Today, we dive headfirst into the specific challenges protesters face when they have the misfortune of confronting a determined autocratic regime. Forget debating policy nuances. We're talking about regimes where survival is job one, and the playbook relies heavily on coercion. We'll dissect the two fundamental pillars of autocratic resilience when faced with popular uprisings. First, the strategic use of repression, making protest incredibly costly and dangerous. And second, the absolutely critical task of maintaining security force loyalty, ensuring the people with the weapons remain on the regime's side. Let's unpack the autocrat survival kit. Before we get to the beatings and betrayals, let's briefly borrow a useful framework. Scholars like Johannes Gerschewski argue that resilient authoritarian regimes typically stand on three legs: legitimation, co-optation, and repression. They try to convince people they have a right to rule, or at least that they deliver the goods, that's legitimation. They strategically hand out benefits and positions to keep important groups happy and potential challengers quiet, that's co-optation. And it's a big but when thousands or millions take to the streets demanding the regime's ouster, the finer points of legitimacy and co-optation often take a backseat. The immediate, existential threat requires pulling the emergency brake, which is repression, backed by loyal security forces. While those other pillars help prevent protests or ensure long-term stability, it's the regime's coercive capacity that forms the hard shield against a revolutionary wave. Recent work by Kendall Taylor and colleagues highlights how modern autocrats increasingly blend these approaches, using sophisticated digital tools to identify exactly who to repress and who to co-opt. But for today, we're focusing primarily on that sharp, nasty edge of autocratic power. Okay, repression. It's not just random violence, it's often a calculated strategy. As scholars like Tilley and Davenport define it, repression involves state actions designed specifically to raise the costs of participating in collective action. The goals are pretty straightforward, as you see on the slide. Deterrence is key, make people too scared to even show up. Think mass arrests, beatings, threats against families. Then there's incapacitation, target the leaders, the organizers, disrupt communication, lock people up. And finally, signaling, sending a clear, brutal message that the regime will not tolerate dissent and will crush it. This ties directly back to our discussion of collective action problems last episode. As Opp and Rohel pointed out, repression massively inflates the costs in Olson's rational calculation. It's not just time off work anymore. It's risking your life, freedom, or livelihood. Look at the grim figures from the recent Iran protests following Mahsa Amini's death. Tens of thousands arrested, hundreds killed. That kind of response is designed explicitly to make people think twice, or 10 times, before joining or continuing protests. Cutting-edge work by Ritter and Conrad reveals that modern regimes are increasingly sophisticated, targeting not just activists themselves, but their entire family networks, creating a multiplier effect that makes each potential activist consider the risk to loved ones. Datasets like the Political Terror Scale and VDEM's Physical Violence Index try, imperfectly, to capture the level of state-sanctioned violence and fear across countries. Now you might think autocrats just unleash maximum force, but it's often more calculated, a kind of gruesome cost-benefit analysis. Repression carries risks for the regime too. Go too soft or be inconsistent, and you might look weak, actually encouraging more people to join the protests. This was arguably a factor in some early Arab Spring phases. But go too hard, especially with indiscriminate violence against unarmed civilians, and you risk provoking a massive backlash, what scholars call the backfire effect. Think Bloody Sunday or images of tanks rolling over students. This can galvanize the opposition, unify disparate groups, attract unwanted international attention and sanctions, and even cause splits within the regime itself if some elites find it too distasteful or risky. This leads regimes to often prefer selective repression, targeting key individuals or networks, which requires good intelligence, over diffuse or widespread violence, though they'll resort to the latter if they feel cornered. Recent work by Su suggests that advanced digital surveillance has dramatically enhanced regimes' ability to identify exactly who to target, potentially reducing the likelihood of backfire by making repression more precise. Look at Belarus in 2020 and 2021, where Lukashenko's regime systematically identified, arrested, and tortured opposition figures while using broader intimidation tactics. This stratified approach effectively crushed what had been a massive protest movement without generating the kind of international backlash a public massacre might have. While researchers search for thresholds where repression becomes counterproductive, predicting that tipping point in real time is incredibly difficult. There's no simple formula. Even the most sophisticated repression strategy fails if the people ordered to carry it out refuse. This brings us to the absolute bedrock of autocratic survival during a crisis: the loyalty of the military, police, and various internal security forces. You can have millions on the street, but if the army holds firm and follows orders to clear them, it's usually game over for the uprising. The core idea here, sometimes called security elite defection theory, is that regimes collapse when the coercive apparatus cracks. So why do soldiers and police often obey orders to fire on their own citizens? It's a mix of factors. There are powerful material incentives. Security forces in autocracies are often privileged, well-paid, and benefit from patronage networks tied directly to the regime. Defection means losing all that. Ideology can play a role: belief in the regime's cause, nationalism, or simply a professional ethos emphasizing order and obedience. Fear is potent too: fear of punishment for disobedience, fear of what happens if the regime falls and score settling begins. And critically, autocrats often deliberately structure their security forces to prevent defection, a practice called coup-proofing. This can involve stacking key units with loyal ethnic or regional groups, creating multiple competing security agencies that watch each other, and embedding political officers or informants throughout the ranks. Fascinating new work by De Bruin shows these parallel structures have increased by 60% globally since 2000. Autocrats are learning from each other. All this makes it incredibly hard and risky for soldiers or units to defect, even if they sympathize with the protesters. The outcomes of mass protests often hinge dramatically on which way the security forces lean. Let's contrast a couple of well-known examples. In Egypt in 2011, the military leadership eventually decided Hosni Mubarak was a liability to their own entrenched institutional interests and facilitated his removal. It wasn't necessarily a conversion to democracy, but a strategic defection from the leader to preserve the system and their place within it. Contrast that with Syria starting in 2011 or China in 1989. In both cases, core security units, often deeply intertwined with the ruling elite through family, sectarian, or ideological ties, remained loyal and were willing to use overwhelming force. The regimes survived at immense human cost. A more recent case is Myanmar since the 2021 coup. Despite massive initial protests and ongoing armed resistance, the military's complete institutional control and decades of preparation against this exact scenario have enabled brutal repression that has killed thousands while keeping the junta in power. What explains these differences? It's complex, historical relationships between the regime and military, the degree to which the security forces see their own fate tied to the regime's ethnic or sectarian bonds, the unity or lack thereof among top generals and officials. Fascinating new work by Guedes and colleagues found that personalist dictatorships, where the leader has direct control over security forces, show 30% higher survival rates during mass protests than other types of autocracies. Crucially, research building on work by scholars like Chenoweth and Stefan strongly suggests a kind of threshold effect. Chenoweth's 2021 updated data confirms that once it becomes clear that the vast majority of the coercive apparatus is sticking with the regime, the chances of protesters forcing regime change plummet, almost irrespective of how many people are in the streets. Unified security loyalty is perhaps the single biggest obstacle. So let's pull back for a moment and summarize what we've dissected today regarding the challenges within autocratic regimes. We looked at authoritarian resilience, zooming in on repression as a key survival tool. We saw how it's used strategically to deter protesters by drastically increasing the personal costs of participation, using the grim examples of Iran and Belarus. We also touched on the tricky balancing act regimes face, repressing enough, but not so much it backfires catastrophically, and how digital surveillance is changing this calculation. Crucially, we identified the loyalty of the security forces as the make or break factor. We explored the complex reasons, material, ideological, structural, why soldiers often obey orders to crack down, contrasting cases where they did, Syria, China, Myanmar, with a notable instance where they didn't, at least initially, Egypt. The key insights: facing a determined autocrat is tough. Their survival often depends fundamentally on their willingness and ability to deploy coercion effectively. They work hard to ensure their security forces remain loyal, often through sophisticated institutional design that's becoming increasingly common globally. Digital technologies have enhanced precision in targeting, allowing more effective repression with potentially fewer downsides for the regime. And perhaps the most sobering insight: sheer numbers of protesters, while inspiring, often prove insufficient against a state whose coercive apparatus remains intact and willing to fight. But autocratic resilience isn't just about domestic repression and loyalty. What role do outside powers play? And what about dynamics within the protest movements themselves? That's where we're headed next time. In Episode 3, we'll examine international factors, how external support or pressure impacts regime survival, and internal movement dynamics, particularly the persistent problem of fragmentation within the opposition. Until then, this is Kaede, signing off.